Welcome to PCC 289M, and we're all about Active Directory in this course. And we're going to have a great term, and we're going to talk about setting up our servers, getting our first lab going. If you recall from 240M, the first week we needed to set up our servers for our lab. Well, we're going to be doing a very similar thing in 289M, and we also do that in 288M as well. So we're in our book, the MCSA Guide to Identity with Windows Server 2016. And we're going to talk about some of the slides here. Here's some of the objectives, describing the role of a directory service, and we're going to install Active Directory, describing different objects, forest, trees, etc., just like that. So the role of a directory service. Network directory service stores information about a computer network and offers features for retrieving and managing that information. So this is an administrative tool. Active Directory users and computers is one of the main tools that we use. Directory Services provides a centralized management tool, but there's lots of setup that goes along with that. So we have the physical structure and we have the logical structure. Physical structure consists of sites and servers, and this is something that we did in 240M and we will do again. Then there's the logical part, and it makes it possible to pattern directory services look and feel after the organization. So every organization is going to have a different way that they want to set up Active Directory. They want to customize it for them. And this course will go over some of that. Let's start with the Active Directory physical structure. Now we did talk about this in 240M, but everything in this course is a deeper dive into Active Directory. So let's first start with the Active Directory site. So it's a physical location where domain controllers communicate and replicate information periodically. So you want to go to Active Directory sites and services. This is where you can see your different sites. And by default, when you create your first Active Directory forest and domain, you create a default first site. But what if you have a lot of different sites? Well, then you need to replicate Active Directory to each of those different sites. 4 organizing components of Active Directory. You've got the organizational units, domains, trees, and forests. So let's start with the OU. It is a container used to organize the network users' resources, and it puts those into logical administrative units. So you can have lots of different things in an OU. Of course, you can have groups, computers, users, any type of object that you can create an Active Directory you can put into an OU. And when you go into Active Directory users and computers, you can see all the different OUs on the left-hand side. So what's a domain? Well, it's the core structural unit of Active Directory. And it represents administrative, security, and policy boundaries. So small companies, medium-sized companies, they typically have one domain. But in a large company, a company may be international, may have a lot of different business units. They may decide to have a domain for each one of those different units so they can logically separate them from each other. And also this has to do with tax and legal reasons as well. If one unit gets sued, you don't want the entire company getting sued and being affected by that. And Active Directory is a great way to segment those different businesses. A tree. What's a tree? Well, it's a group of domains that share a common naming structure. So you've also got the forest. Well, that's a collection of one or more Active Directory trees. So you may not see this necessarily in small and medium-sized businesses, but the larger you go, the more trees you're going to find, the more forests you're going to find, especially when you get into mergers and acquisitions. So when one company merges with another, they're going to be combining their forest into one forest, or they're going to decide to keep those forests separate depending on the way that they need to organize their structure. So this gives you a good idea of what a tree looks like. This is a forest of 2 trees. It's a pretty small forest. But on the left-hand side, you've got the forest, and underneath that, you've got child domains. On the right-hand side, you've got very similar as well. So child domains, those are something we're also going to cover in this course. So don't worry, we will discuss what all that means. Active Directory Service, commonly referred to Active Directory Domain Services, or ADDS, and we need to install it, of course. So if DNS is not already present on the network, you need to install a DNS server. Well, when you promote a server to be a domain controller, it automatically creates the first DNS server as well. So if you don't already have DNS on there, then it will put it on, which we'll be doing in our first lab. All right, so after you've promoted, you're prompted for the fully qualified domain name, you have to decide what you're going to call our new forest and domain. So we're going to call it widgetllc.internal, just like we did in 240M. And the funny thing is, when you create your first forest and your first domain, they're actually called the same thing. So if we call it widgetllc.internal, that's both the name of the forest and the name of the domain itself. So don't get too confused by that. So we have to put a password in for directory services restore mode before we continue. So why would we do that? Well, if Active Directory breaks, but the Windows operating system is still working fine, then we can boot into this DSRM. And we have to have a special password for that. It's sort of like a local password account. So we put the password in, we can gain access into the server and into DSRM mode, and then we can fix Active Directory, reboot into normal mode, and then Active Directory comes up, hopefully. Here's what it looks like when you go through the wizard. You've got your DSRM password information towards the bottom, and you've got your forest and domain functional level, which by default is going to be Server 2016. Now, if you have any domain controllers that are older than that, then you need to, of course, go back to the oldest forest and domain functional level for whatever domain controller you have. Otherwise, you will effectively make that domain controller useless. It will no longer function right. In the DNS options window, you must create the DNS delegation, and that allows Windows to create all these different records that are needed for the new domain. You also need to specify a NetBIOS name, and that's for backwards compatibility. So it's not really just for backwards compatibility, it's also for when you put your username and password in. So when we go to reboot our computer, once it becomes a domain controller, we've got to log in. So we're no longer logging in as a local administrator because that account's been deleted when you make a server domain controller. So what you do is you log in with the NetBIOS name, which in our case is going to be widget LLC, and then the / and then administrator. So that's how we log in. So the NetBIOS name is used for not only backwards compatibility, but also it's how we log into the server as well. And this is what it looks like when we specify the location where we're putting Active Directory, domain services, and the database, and the log files as well as the sysvol folder. And the sysvol contains all of the Active Directory files. You can change that if you want, but I would recommend you just leave it as the default. And there's a prerequisite check, as you see here, and as long as you don't see anything red in this item, then the install button will light up, which it is in this graphic. So you can safely ignore anything that shows up with a yellow triangle. You can certainly look at it and see if you can resolve it, but it's nothing that's that important. Microsoft recommends at least 2 domain controllers in every domain. Why? Well, what if one goes down? You've got to still be able to authenticate users. So it does fault tolerance and it does load balancing as well. When you go to do the installation on a second domain controller, you want to add a domain controller to an existing domain. Don't choose to add a new forest on your second domain controller. Otherwise, you'll create 2 different forests with the same name, and then you'll have nothing but problems, and we'll have to undo all that. So when a new DC is added, you need to know the answers to the following questions. Should you install DNS? Well, it's installed by default. Should the DC be a global catalog server? Well, the first one is. That keeps a copy of all of Active Directory. Any ones after that, by default, will, unless you uncheck the box. Should this be a read-only domain controller? Well, in most cases, it's not, but we will be doing a read-only domain controller as a lab. And in which site should the DC be located? By default, it's going to be in the default first site name, but we're going to be creating sites later on in our course. So here is all that information in the wizard. And like I said, when you go to add your second domain controller, you want to add a domain controller to an existing domain. If you want to add a second domain, which we're not doing in this course, you would add a new domain to an existing forest. But in our DC01, we're choosing the first option, which is add a new forest. So then you have the domain type, domain name, etc. All right, we're going to use Active Directory to perform many different tasks. We've got, and that's the Administrative Center, ADAC. Hardly anybody ever uses Active Directory Administrative Center, but it is a very good tool that you can use, and you can turn things on such as the recycling bin. So you can get things that you deleted accidentally. And this is the Active Directory recycling bin, not the regular one. So we can create and manage user groups and computer accounts, manage OUs. So basically there's two different tools that do the same thing. Active Directory users and computers, and this Active Directory Administrative Center. They both can do creation, management, and things like that. So whichever one you feel more comfortable doing, you can use that tool. But Active Directory Administrative Center also has some additional things as well. You can use PowerShell to run Active Directory commands. So you don't have to use the GUI for everything. And of course, when you use PowerShell, you have some additional options that you don't get otherwise. So what's inside Active Directory? Well, this is that administrative center. So it looks very similar to users and computers. You see the domain. You also see some additional things, such as you can raise your forest and domain functional level from here without having to go to the sites and services or domains and trusts. You can also go and turn on what's called dynamic access control, and you can configure authentication. So there's definitely a few more tools in this one, and some people may prefer to use it. All right, so here we've got Windows PowerShell history. Anytime somebody has a PowerShell run, then you can go ahead and see what the history of that was. And even if you run it as a GUI, you'll see the PowerShell history of what it was that it did in the background. A container contains other objects. So we've talked about organizational units. Now let's talk about containers. Used to organize and manage users and resources. And it can also act as administrative and security boundaries. So there's three different types of containers. Organizational units is one of them. Then also we've got folder objects and we've got domain objects. So what are those? Well, we talked about OU, it's being a container for organizing and managing resources. Folder objects, and there's 5 of them by default, built-in computers, foreign, managed service accounts, and users. These look just like the organizational units on the left-hand side of administrative users and computers. However, they don't have a little icon inside them. They just look like yellow folders, and that's it. So that's how you can tell the difference between a folder and an organizational unit. So folders don't have the same kind of capability. With an organizational unit, you can apply a group policy to the objects inside it, such as turning off control panels so users can't see it. But folders don't have that. Folders are just places to store things. Let's talk about user accounts. When you log in to a computer, you are being authenticated by the Active Directory domain controller. Authentication confirms a user's identity. A local user account is authorized to access resources only on that computer. So when you go to log into your client, say we're going to be building a Windows 10 client, the first time you log in, you're logging in locally to that computer. But after we join it to be a member of the domain, then you're going to be logging into the domain. And so you have different rights when you log into Widget LLC / your admin user than you do when you log into as your local self, as the local user to that computer. Windows does create 2 built-in user accounts, administrator and guest. Now Windows 10, those are both disabled. On Windows 2016 server, administrator is enabled, but guest is disabled. Permissions, it defines which resources users can access and what level that they have. And of course there's rights that specifies the types of actions a user can perform on a computer or network. So lots of different things going on there. Groups are used to assign members permissions and rights. So you can take a whole bunch of users that need to have the same rights and permissions and you can put them into a group. And then anytime somebody joins your organization or leaves your organization, you can just add or delete them from that group rather than going in and individually adding all their rights and permissions, which takes a lot longer. Another AD object is a computer account. So when you join a computer to a domain, it automatically creates an account. And it represents a computer that's a domain controller or domain member. So our Windows 10 computer is going to be a domain member, whereas our DC01 and 02 are going to be domain controllers. The computer account object's name must match the name of the computer that the account represents. So what do you do if you delete one of these objects? Well, if you have enabled in Active Directory Administrative Center the recycle bin, then you can just go to the deleted objects folder and restore it. If you didn't, then you need to restore from backup or learn about 20 PowerShell commands to get it back. So, and it doesn't always work. I've actually tried to do it, or I got one to work and one didn't. Active Directory Recycle Bin is disabled by default, but you can enable it in the Administrative Center. And then after you enable it, the recycle bin cannot be disabled without reinstalling all domain controllers in the forest. So I'm not sure exactly what Microsoft is thinking about what the security risk is with turning on the recycle bin and then having it not enabled by default and then not being able to turn it back off again. I'm not sure if it's just a programming issue or if it's a security issue, but it's pretty annoying. So it's very easy to restore when you have the recycle bin turned on. Active Directory objects can be searched for using the Find Users, Contacts, and Groups dialog box. So if you have a very large organization and you're trying to find a particular user, you can just type in the first name, the last name, the logon name, anything that would be in the box, in the properties box of that user. You can search and find that particular user, and then you can manage that user at that time. So let's talk about a few things like replication. So we're going to be doing replication in one of our labs. You've got different types of replication. And replication just represents copying Active Directory from one domain controller to another. That's all it is. So there's intra-site replication. That's when the domain controllers are in the same site, such as DCO1 and DCO2. They're in the same site. So when they replicate, it's intra-site. But when we create a new site and we create another domain controller that's going to be in a different site, then that's inter-site replication. So it's pretty easy to remember that, like interstate, intrastate. Knowledge consistency checker runs on all DCs to determine the replication topology. So lots of different parts that have to do with replication. Operation master role. So by default, the first domain controller, in our case DCO1, is going to get 5 operations master roles. You're going to get the schema master, infrastructure, domain naming, RID master, and the PDC emulator. And all these things do things that make Active Directory run. So if you don't have these 5 roles, even though Active Directory may continue to run for a little while, you won't be able to make any changes to Active Directory. So if one of your servers goes down that's running those master roles, you have to seize that role on another computer. And we'll be doing that in one of our labs. In Active Directory, a trust relationship defines whether and how security principals can access each other. So again, mergers and acquisitions is a great example of trusting. So if you've got company A and company B, maybe they merge together, for instance, then you've got to have 2 different forests that trust each other so the employees can gain access to the data on both sides. Global Catalog Server, the first domain controller installed in a forest, is known as the Global Catalog Server, sometimes referred to as a GC, and they have several different functions. They facilitate domain and forest-wide searches. So when you're searching for something, you're actually searching inside these folders, the sysfile folder, on a Global Catalog Server. And DCO1 is going to be one, and DCO2 is going to be one. So you have to uncheck the box to get it to not be one. Facilitates logon across domains. So if you have multiple domains, it does that as well. And it holds universal group membership. Universal groups are security groups that go across domains. So if you have multiple domains, then that's where that information is held. The first domain in the forest is referred to as the forest root domain. If it disappears, the entire structure ceases to operate. And I've actually seen this happen in many cases where a company owns another company, they sell it to somebody else, and they take their parent of Active Directory with them. It's out the door. So all that's left is the child domain. Well, that child domain without a parent is only going to function for so long before you have massive problems. So you have to basically create a whole new structure and migrate those people off the child domain into a brand new parent. Functions the forest root domain handles are DNS server, global catalog, forest-wide administrative accounts, and operation master roles. Most small and medium-sized businesses, as I mentioned, they just have a single domain, single forest, type of situation. It's simpler, lower cost, easier to manage, and easier to access resources. Using more than one domain makes sense or even necessity if you have these different things happen. need for differing account policies, name identities, tighter security. So if you don't want one user accessing data from another business unit, having separate Active Directories will also tighten that security down. Group policies. We did a little group policy in 240M, but we're definitely going to be doing more of that here. It's a list of settings that you can use to tell computers and users what they can and cannot do. And there's hundreds of different options. Now, by default, there's two GPOs that are created. The default domain policy, which affects all users and groups, and the default domain controller policy, which just affects domain controllers. And the reason you want to have those separate is because if you go in and say turn off control panel for all users and you don't have a separate policy for the domain controllers, then when you go into the server, domain controllers is going to be gone for you as well. So you don't want that to happen. So you have these two separate policies. And you can use the group policy management console to get into those. And this is what the group policy manager looks like. So you can take a look at the domain at the top. There's the default domain policy. If you expanded the domain controllers, you would see that as well. And on the right-hand side, you can see, if you expanded everything there, you would see all the different policies that are being applied. So by default, there's not a lot of policies that are applied other than password policies, a couple things like that. But you can certainly open that up. All right, well, we talked a lot about the Active Directory and getting you all set up, geared up for the first lab and the first quiz as well. So remember that when you go to take the quiz, it is open book. All of the answers are either in the book or in the slide presentation. Now, this is an abbreviated slide presentation I gave you here. The expanded slide presentation is in Content Module 1, Module 2, etc., where it actually says Module 1 presentation slides. So you can go into there when you go in to take your test to search up for the answers as well. So we are all set with Module 1. Go ahead and get started, and I'll see you in Module 2.